You know that feeling when you stumble across something in history that makes you freeze? When you read a line in an old document and you have to stop, put it down, and just breathe. That's what happened to me about 6 months ago when I found a letter tucked away in the archives of the British Library. It was written in 1631 by a woman named Anne Barrett. She was from Cornwall, England, a fisherman's daughter, 23 years old when she wrote it. The letter was addressed to her sister back home, but here's the thing, Anne never sent it. She couldn't, because by the time she finished writing those desperate words on crumbling parchment, she was sitting in a cell in Algiers, North Africa, waiting to be sold. Again. The last line of that letter still haunts me. She wrote, "Tell mother I died in the storm. It will be kinder than the truth." Now, you might be thinking you know this story. You've heard about slavery. You've learned about the Atlantic slave trade, the horrors of the Middle Passage, the plantations. And yes, those stories are crucial. Those stories need to be told and remembered. But there's another slave trade that history has almost completely erased from our collective memory. One that lasted longer, actually far longer than most people realize. One that, in some ways, was even more insidious in how it destroyed not just bodies, but entire identities. I'm talking about the Arab slave trade, and specifically what happened to European women who were captured and dragged into a system that didn't just steal their freedom, it erased their very identity, their faith, their names, their souls. It made them disappear so completely that their own grandchildren would never know they existed. This is a story about women like Anne Barrett, women whose names you've never heard, women who vanished from European shores and were never seen again, women who suffered fates that in many ways were considered worse than death itself by those who knew what awaited them, women who became ghosts in their own lifetimes. So sit with me for a while, because what I'm about to share with you isn't easy, it's not comfortable, but it's real, and it's time we talked about it. It's time we remembered them. Let me take you back to a summer morning in 1627, to a small coastal village in Iceland called Heimaey. The sun was just starting to peek over the horizon when Gudrun Simonadóttir stepped outside her family's turf house. She was 17 years old, with blonde hair that she kept braided down her back, and she was thinking about the most ordinary things, about the bread she needed to bake, about the wool she needed to card, about the boy from the neighboring farm who had smiled at her after church the previous Sunday. His name was Jon, and she'd been thinking about him more and more lately, wondering if maybe this summer he might speak to her father about courtship. The air smelled like salt and fish and peat smoke. It was peaceful. It was home. It was the only world she'd ever known. She'd never been more than 20 miles from this village. She'd never seen a tree taller than a scrubby willow. She'd never met anyone who wasn't Icelandic, who didn't speak her language, who didn't worship in the same church where her parents had been married and where she herself had been baptized as a baby. She didn't hear them coming. By the time she saw the ships, 3 of them, with lateen sails cutting across the gray morning sea, it was already too late. By the time she heard the screams from the other side of the village, the raiders were already in the streets. By the time she understood that this was real, that this was actually happening, rough hands were grabbing her arms. They were Barbary corsairs, North African pirates operating out of Algiers and Tunis and Salé, and they had sailed thousands of miles north for one purpose: to capture slaves. They had crossed the Mediterranean, sailed past Gibraltar, ventured into the rough Atlantic waters, navigated the dangerous North Sea, all the way to this remote island that most Europeans didn't even know existed. But here's what most people don't understand about these raids. This wasn't random piracy. This wasn't opportunistic. This was an industrial operation, a sophisticated business model that had been running for centuries. These corsairs had maps. Detailed maps showing every coastal village from Morocco to the Arctic Circle. They had intelligence networks. They had spies in European ports who would scout targets and send back reports. They knew exactly which villages to hit, exactly when to hit them for maximum capture with minimum resistance, exactly what they were looking for. And what they were looking for more than anything was women. Young women, Fair-skinned women, European women, blonde women, red-haired women with green eyes and blue eyes, women who would stand out in North African markets like exotic jewels. Because in the slave markets of North Africa and the Ottoman Empire, these women were worth their weight in gold, literally. A young Scandinavian woman could fetch prices equivalent to several years' wages for a skilled craftsman. She was an investment, a luxury good, a status symbol for wealthy merchants and Ottoman officials. Gudrun tried to run. Of course she did. She dropped the wooden bucket she'd been carrying and ran towards the church, thinking maybe the priest could help, maybe there was sanctuary there. She made it maybe 50 feet before a corsair grabbed her by the hair and dragged her backward into the dirt. She fought, she screamed, she bit and clawed and kicked with everything she had. It didn't matter. He was twice her size, battle-hardened, trained for exactly this kind of resistance. Within minutes, she was bound at the wrists with rough rope, thrown in a line with dozens of other captives, her neighbors, her friends, people she'd known her entire life. Her mother was there, blood running down her face from where she'd been struck. Her younger sister, only 14 years old, was there too, sobbing hysterically. Her father? She couldn't see her father. She called out for him. No answer. She would learn later that he had died trying to defend their home, cut down by a corsair's sword in his own doorway. The village was burning behind them. The church bell that had called her to worship every Sunday was silent now because the raiders had killed the priest when he tried to defend his flock. Old Magnus, the blacksmith, lay dead in the street, his blood pooling on the stones he had helped lay 30 years ago. The children from the schoolhouse where she'd learned to read were being dragged to the beach, screaming for their parents. 342 people were taken from Hemai that day. Men, women, children, entire families. The raiders took about 2/3 of the village's population, but the women, especially the young unmarried women, they were separated almost immediately. They were valuable. They needed to be preserved, kept healthy, kept presentable. The men might die in the galleys rowing ships. The children might be sold to whoever they wanted. But the young women? They were destined for a very specific market, because they had a very specific destination ahead of them. The journey south took weeks. They were packed into the holds of the corsair ships, given barely enough food and water to survive. Gudrun was chained next to her younger sister in the darkness below deck. They could hear the waves against the hull, could feel the ship rising and falling, could smell the salt water mixing with the stench of unwashed bodies and human waste. There was one bucket for 20 women to relieve themselves. No privacy, no dignity. Many didn't survive. The elderly, the very young, the sick, they died in the darkness below deck, and their bodies were simply thrown overboard. Gudrun watched her mother grow weaker day by day. The head wound wasn't healing. She developed a fever. On the 8th day at sea, she died, and Gudrun had to watch as the corsairs dragged her mother's body up the ladder and tossed it into the ocean like garbage. Her sister screamed so loud and so long that one of the corsairs came down and beat her until she went quiet. After that, they both learned to cry silently. Gudrun survived. She survived because she was young and strong, and because the corsairs made sure she survived. She was an investment now, a commodity. They couldn't let her die or even get too sick, because that would lower her market value. So she got slightly more water than the elderly captives, slightly more food. When disease swept through the hold, and it did, a week into the voyage, the young women were moved to a different section away from the sick. When they finally reached Algiers, she had lost 30 pounds. Her blonde hair was matted and filthy, caked with salt and blood. Her wrists were raw from the shackles. But she was alive. Her sister was alive. And that's when their real nightmare began.
You see, here's what we need to understand about the Arab slave trade, particularly the Barbary slave trade that operated out of North Africa. It was massive. We're talking about a system that enslaved between 1 and 1.25 million Europeans between the 16th and 19th centuries. Let that sink in for a second. Over 1 million white Europeans, captured from coastal villages and ships and sold into slavery in North Africa and the Middle East. But those numbers, as shocking as they are, they don't tell the full story. Because it wasn't just the scale of it, it was the nature of it. It was what happened to these people, and particularly to the women, that makes this trade uniquely cruel in the annals of human trafficking. When African slaves were taken to the Americas, as horrific as that was, and let me be clear, it was absolutely horrific, there was at least the grim reality that families sometimes stayed together, at least initially. Communities formed. Cultural traditions were preserved in secret, passed down through generations. There was resistance, there was survival, there were slave revolts, there were escape networks, there was eventually abolition, fought for and won. There was memory, there was history preserved. But the women taken in the Arab slave trade, they vanished. Completely, utterly, without a trace. Because the purpose was different, the system was different, the end goal was different. These European women weren't being taken to work in fields or mines. They weren't being taken for manual labor at all. They weren't going to be field hands or domestic servants in the way we typically think of slavery. They were being taken for harems, for concubinage, for forced sexual slavery and forced reproduction, for forced conversion and complete assimilation into Islamic society. They were being taken to be transformed, to be remade, to be erased and replaced with something entirely different. And here's the truly insidious part. Once they converted, once they were absorbed into the household of a wealthy merchant or Ottoman official, once they had children with their captors, they ceased to exist as Europeans entirely. Their names were changed, their pasts were erased, their families back home would never know what happened to them. There were no records sent back to Europe saying, "Your daughter is now Fatima, wife of merchant so-and-so in Algiers." There was just nothing. Silence. Absence. There was no underground railroad for them. There was no abolition movement fighting for their freedom, no escape route back to Europe, no hope of return. Just silence. Just erasure. Just the slow, systematic destruction of everything they had been. Imagine for a second what that means. Imagine being Gudrun, dragged from your fishing village in Iceland, a place so remote that it might as well have been the edge of the world, and finding yourself standing on an auction block in Algiers, being inspected like livestock by men who spoke a language you couldn't understand, in a world so alien it might as well have been another planet. The heat alone, she had never felt heat like this. Iceland barely got warm even in summer, and here she was in North Africa, where the sun beat down mercilessly, where the very air felt foreign in her lungs. The slave market in Algiers was called the Bedestan. It was a large covered building near the port, a stone structure with high ceilings and narrow windows that let in shafts of dusty sunlight. And it reeked of sweat and fear and desperation and unwashed bodies and something else, something undefinable, the smell of human misery concentrated in one place. European captives were brought there in chains, displayed on raised platforms while buyers circulated around them, examining them like you would examine a horse at market. Merchants would circle the platforms, discussing the merchandise, pointing at particular captives, debating their worth. For the men, the evaluation was straightforward. Are you strong enough to row a galley, to work in a quarry, to carry stones for construction? Can you work until you drop? The mortality rate for male galley slaves was astronomical. Most died within 2 years of brutal labor, chained to oars, rowing until their hearts gave out, but there was always demand for more. But for the women, the inspection was far more intimate, far more humiliating, far more degrading. They were stripped, completely naked, in front of crowds of strange men. Their hair was examined for lice, for texture, for color. Their bodies were checked for marks, for scars, for any imperfection that might lower their value. Their teeth were examined. Healthy teeth meant good breeding potential. Their skin was scrutinized. Fair skin without blemishes was premium. And most degrading of all, they were evaluated for virginity, for fertility, for their potential to bear children for their future masters. This wasn't subtle. This wasn't private. This was public physical examination by buyers who wanted to make sure they were getting their money's worth. Gudrun stood on that platform, naked and trembling in the North African heat, while strange men debated her worth in Arabic. She couldn't understand the words, but she understood the looks. She understood the hands that poked and prodded her like she was a horse at market. She understood when one merchant squeezed her arm and nodded approvingly at her muscle tone. She understood when another examined her teeth and hair and smiled. She was sold for 800 silver coins to a Turkish merchant named Hassan Aga. He was 53 years old, had 2 wives already, and was looking to expand his household with a young European concubine who could give him more sons. His existing wives had given him mostly daughters, and he wanted male heirs. A young, healthy European girl with good breeding hips, that's what the slave trader promised him.
a good investment. Gudrun was taken to his house in the Kasbah, the old fortress quarter of Algiers that overlooked the Mediterranean. The house was beautiful in a way she'd never seen. Tiled courtyards with fountains that actually worked, rooms draped in silk that must have cost a fortune, the smell of orange blossoms and exotic spices she couldn't name wafting through the air. The wealth on display was staggering. In Iceland, even wealthy families lived simply. Here, even the servants wore better clothing than Icelandic merchants. It should have felt like a palace. It should have been magnificent. But it was a prison. A beautiful, gilded, luxurious prison, but a prison nonetheless. And here's where the story gets even darker, because what happened next was the systematic destruction of everything Gudrun had been. She was given a new name, Fatima. The wives chose it. They took some pleasure in naming her, in marking her as their husband's new property. She was told she would convert to Islam. Not asked, told. Conversion wasn't optional, it was a requirement. Because under Islamic law, a Muslim man couldn't keep a Christian woman as a permanent concubine. She had to convert first. As a Christian, she could only be temporary property, with even fewer rights. As a Muslim convert, she could potentially be elevated to wife status if she bore sons. Now, some historians will argue that these conversions were voluntary, that these women chose to convert to improve their situations, to gain legal protections, to survive. And in a sense, they're right. It was survival. But let's not pretend it was a real choice. When the alternative to conversion is remaining a slave with zero rights, zero protection, zero hope of ever improving your status, when conversion is the only path to even a marginal improvement in your circumstances, when you're told convert or we'll sell you to someone much worse, can we really call that voluntary? That's like saying someone gives you their wallet at gunpoint, voluntarily handed it over. Technically true, meaningfully false. Gudrun, now Fatima, was taught to pray 5 times a day. She was taught to recite the Shahada, the Islamic declaration of faith. There is no God but God, and Muhammad is his prophet. She had to say it, had to mean it, or at least pretend to mean it convincingly. She was dressed in the clothing of a Muslim woman, long robes, head coverings. She was forbidden from speaking Icelandic, forbidden from even mentioning her previous life, forbidden from talking about her family or her home or the church where she used to worship. The 2 wives, Hassan Aga's first and second wives, they supervised her conversion. They taught her the prayers, corrected her Arabic pronunciation, showed her how to dress, how to walk, how to behave. They weren't particularly cruel about it, but they weren't kind either. To them, she was a curiosity, a foreign slave girl that her husband had brought home, and their job was to make her presentable and useful. Within 6 months, she had learned enough Arabic to understand her master's commands. Within a year, she was pregnant with his child. She was 16 years old. The father of her child was 53, owned 2 other wives, and had purchased her like you'd purchase a piece of furniture. And here's the thing that breaks my heart. By the time she gave birth to a son, by the time she had been in Hassan Aga's household for 2 years, the historical record suggests she had accepted her new identity. Not because she wanted to, not because she had forgotten Iceland or her family or who she used to be, but because that's what trauma does. That's what survival requires. You adapt or you break. And breaking meant madness or death. She named her son Muhammad, after the prophet. She raised him as a Muslim. She taught him Arabic, taught him to pray, taught him the Quran. She never told him about Iceland, about her real name, about the family she left behind. She never told him about his grandfather who died defending his home, or his grandmother who died at sea, or his aunt who had been sold to a different master in Tunis and Gudrun would never see again. Because what would be the point? He was Turkish now, Ottoman, Muslim. She was Turkish now. The girl who baked bread in a turf house on a cold island in the North Atlantic, that girl was gone. Gudrun Simonardóttir was dead. Only Fatima remained. And the worst part? She had to make that choice consciously. She had to kill Gudrun in order for Fatima to survive. But Gudrun's story, as tragic as it is, actually was one of the better outcomes, and that should tell you something about how horrific this system was. Because she at least ended up in a relatively stable household. She wasn't beaten daily, she was fed, she was housed, her child was recognized as legitimate. She achieved a sort of low-status security. But not all captured European women ended up as concubines in merchant households. Some had far worse fates awaiting them. Let me tell you about the imperial harems, because that's where this system reveals its true face. Now, when we hear the word harem today, we often think of something exotic and romantic. Beautiful women lounging on silk cushions, eating grapes, maybe some sensual music playing in the background. That's the Orientalist fantasy, the Hollywood version, the one that was sold to Western audiences in the 19th century.
But let me tell you about something that haunted these European coastal communities even more than the raids themselves: the letters. The desperate, heartbreaking letters that came back from captivity. You remember Anne Barrett, the woman I mentioned at the beginning, the fisherman's daughter from Cornwall who wrote that letter from Algiers? She wasn't the only one. There are dozens, maybe hundreds of letters that have survived in various European archives, letters written by captured men and women, smuggled back to Europe by sympathetic merchants or redeemed captives, begging their families to ransom them before it was too late. Because here's the thing, ransom was possible. It was actually a well-established system if you had money, if you had connections, if you acted fast, if your family could scrape together enough silver before you were sold to someone who wouldn't negotiate. There were entire religious orders dedicated to ransoming Christian captives, the Trinitarians, founded in 1198, and the Mercedarians, founded in 1218. These were monks and friars who devoted their entire lives to this mission. They would travel to North Africa with bags of silver, negotiate with the corsairs and slave owners, and buy back European captives. They would then bring these redeemed captives back to Europe, sometimes spending years arranging these ransoms. It was dangerous work. Some of the monks were themselves captured and enslaved. Some were killed. Some contracted diseases and died in North Africa. But they kept going, year after year, century after century, because they believed they were doing God's work. But there was never enough money, never enough ransoms. The demand was too great. For every person redeemed, 10 more were captured, 20 more, 50 more. The orders would return to Europe with maybe 100 redeemed captives, and there would be letters from 1,000 more still in bondage, begging for help that would never come. And the letters... God, the letters are heartbreaking. They're some of the most emotionally devastating documents I've ever read. There's one in the archives in Madrid, written in 1643 by a Spanish woman named Isabel de Castro. She was 24 years old when she was captured in a raid on a village near Malaga. She was captured with her mother and younger brother. The corsairs killed her father when he tried to resist. They were taken to Algiers and sold to different masters. Isabel was sold to a merchant. Her mother was sold to someone else. Isabel never saw her again. Her brother, being young and strong, was put on a galley as a rower. He died within 6 months, chained to an oar, his body thrown overboard when his heart gave out from exhaustion. Isabel managed to bribe a Christian slave, a man who had some freedom of movement because he was a skilled carpenter, to carry a letter back to Spain for her. It took her 6 months to save enough from food scraps and small favors to pay him. In the letter, she tells her family she's being held by a man named Murad ibn Ahmed. She says she's been forced to convert to Islam, but that in her heart she remains Christian. She says she prays the Ave Maria in secret at night. She begs them to send money for her ransom, 300 gold ducats, which is what her master is demanding. Then, at the end of the letter, she writes something that still makes me cry when I think about it. She says, "If you cannot send the money, please send word that you tried. I need to know I am remembered. I need to know I still exist to someone. I need to know someone in the world knows my name and remembers who I was." Her family sent the money. It took them 8 months to raise it. They sold their house, their land, everything they had. They borrowed from relatives and neighbors. They gathered 300 gold ducats and sent it with a Mercedarian friar who was traveling to Algiers. By the time the ransom arrived in Algiers, Isabel was already dead. She had died in childbirth, bearing her master's child. Both she and the baby died. She was 25 years old. The money was returned to Spain. Some of it. The friar used part of it to ransom other captives. The child died too. Isabel's master kept the money he had been promised and used it to buy another slave girl to replace Isabel. That's the thing about this slave trade that makes it so particularly cruel. It didn't just steal people's freedom. It didn't just brutalize them. It erased them completely.
And it did so with bureaucratic efficiency, with commercial calculation, with absolute indifference to human suffering. Now, let me take you back to a different kind of raid, because I want you to understand the sheer geographic scope, the incredible reach of what we're talking about here. Most people think the Barbary corsairs only operated in the Mediterranean, maybe occasionally venturing into the Atlantic near Spain and Portugal. That's not true. Not even close. They raided as far north as Iceland, which we already talked about. They raided England, Ireland, Scotland regularly. They raided the southern coast of Spain and Portugal so often that entire towns were abandoned. They raided villages in Denmark and Norway. They even, incredibly, raided as far as Newfoundland and the Maritimes in what's now Canada. There are records of corsair raids on European fishing settlements in North America. The geographic scope was staggering. These weren't just Mediterranean operations, these were Atlantic operations, North Sea operations. We're talking about North African corsairs sailing thousands of miles from home, navigating dangerous waters, all to capture slaves. But one of the most audacious raids, one that really captured European imagination and terror, happened in 1631, and it wasn't on some remote coastal village, it was on Baltimore, a town in southwest Ireland, a place that should have been safe, should have been protected. The raid was led by a Dutch corsair named Jan Johnson, but here's the twist. He had converted to Islam, taken the name Murad Reis, and was operating out of Saleh in Morocco. He was a European renegade, a turncoat who had abandoned Christianity, joined the corsairs, and now raiding his former Christian brethren. And he wasn't alone. There were many such renegades. Estimates suggest maybe 10 to 15% of corsair crews were Europeans who had converted to Islam and joined the trade. Some did it for money, some did it to avoid being enslaved themselves. If you were captured and converted, you could join your captors. Some did it out of genuine religious conviction, but whatever their reasons, they were there. Europeans raiding Europe, Christians turned Muslims attacking Christians. Murad Reis had a fleet of ships and a crew that was a mix of North African corsairs, Ottoman Turks, and European renegades. They were professional raiders, experienced, disciplined, effective. They struck at Baltimore at night on June 20th. It was a Tuesday. The town was asleep. There were no guards posted. Why would there be? This was Ireland, part of the British Isles, not some Mediterranean coastal village. The threat of Barbary raids seemed remote, theoretical. They were wrong. The corsairs landed their boats on the beach, crept into town in the darkness, and then struck. House to house, kicking in doors, dragging people from their beds. Men, women, children, it didn't matter. If you couldn't fight back effectively, you were taken. The men who tried to resist were killed. The elderly who couldn't keep up were left behind or killed. Everyone else was taken. 107 people were captured that night. 43 of them were women. 26 of them were children under the age of 15. Entire families were taken. The local blacksmith, his wife, their 3 children, gone. The miller and his pregnant wife, gone. The widow who ran the bakery and her 2 teenage daughters, gone. They were marched to the beach, hands bound, mouths gagged if they screamed too much. They were loaded onto boats, rowed out to the corsair ships waiting offshore in the darkness. And by the time the sun rose and people from neighboring villages came to investigate the silence, the corsairs were gone, and Baltimore was a ghost town. Doors hanging open, fires still burning in hearths, food still on tables. It was like the rapture had happened, and everyone had just vanished. The English government, which controlled Ireland at the time, was outraged. They sent warships to try to intercept the corsairs. They failed. The corsair ships were too fast, too well designed for speed and maneuverability. They knew the waters. They knew where to hide. They knew how to evade pursuit. Within 2 weeks, the captives from Baltimore were being sold in the slave markets of Algiers and Saleh. Within a month, they were scattered across North Africa and the Ottoman Empire, absorbed into households, into harems, into galleys. Within a year, most of them had converted to Islam, by force, or by calculation, or by sheer psychological necessity. Only 3 people from that raid ever made it back to Ireland, 3 out of 107. about 2 men who were ransomed after years in the galleys, and 1 woman who was ransomed by her family, though it took them 11 years to raise it, and by then she had converted, taken a Muslim name, had borne children to her master. When she returned to Baltimore, she was a stranger. She spoke with an accent. She wore North African clothing. She had forgotten how to make Irish soda bread. She had become someone else. There's a ballad that was written about the raid called The Sack of Baltimore. It's still sung in Ireland today, in pubs and at festivals. One of the verses goes, "The yell of Allah breaks above the shriek and roar. O blessed God, the Algerine is Lord of Baltimore." It's haunting. It captures the terror, the religious dimension, the sense of helplessness that these communities felt. The town never recovered. Most of the survivors left. They moved inland, away from the coast. The harbor that had once been bustling with fishing boats fell silent. Houses were abandoned. The church fell into disrepair. Baltimore became a warning tale, a ghost story that mothers told their children to make them come inside before dark. "Stay away from the water," they would say. "The Turks might come. The Moors might take you." And those 107 people who were taken, they disappeared into the slave markets of North Africa, into the harems and households and galleys, and history forgot their names. We know some of them. We have records of a few who were ransomed, but most...
Let me tell you about one more woman, because her story, as fragmentary as it is, gives us a rare, precious glimpse into what life was actually like for these women after they were absorbed into Muslim households. It shows us the psychological complexity, the impossible choices, the way trauma reshapes identity. Her name was Elizabeth Morgan. She was from Cornwall, England, from a fishing village called Mousehole. Captured in 1640 during a raid on the Cornish coast near Penzance, she was 18 years old, engaged to be married to a local fisherman named Thomas, planning her wedding for that autumn. We know about Elizabeth because unusually she was ransomed, but not until she'd been in captivity for 7 years. 7 years. 7 years is a lifetime. 7 years is long enough to become someone else entirely. When she finally made it back to England in 1647, she was interviewed by a priest named Father John Williams, who wanted to document her story for the church. He was collecting testimonies of ransomed captives, trying to understand the scope of the problem, trying to raise awareness and money for more ransom efforts. The interview, or at least fragments of it, survives in the archives of Exeter Cathedral. It's extraordinary. It's one of the most detailed first-hand accounts we have. And what Elizabeth describes is complicated, messy, not the simple story of victimhood and rescue that Father Williams seemed to be expecting. She says she was sold to a merchant in Tunis named Abd al-Rahman. She says she was forced to convert to Islam and was given the name Zara. She says she was treated relatively well, not beaten, given adequate food, taught to read Arabic, taught to embroider, given work that wasn't backbreaking labor. She says her master had 2 other wives, both North African Muslim women, both older than her. She says they treated her with a mixture of pity and contempt. They pitied her because she was foreign and alone, because she had no family, because she was ignorant of their customs and language. They held her in contempt because she was a slave, a concubine, lower in status than a proper wife, forever marked as property that had been purchased. She had 2 children with Abd al-Rahman, both boys. She loved them fiercely, she says. That's clear in the interview. She talks about them with an intensity that clearly makes Father Williams uncomfortable. She talks about their first words, their first steps, their personalities. She talks about nursing them, singing to them, Cornish lullabies at first, but then, as the years passed, Arabic songs she learned from the other wives. And here's where the interview becomes almost unbearable to read, where you can feel Father Williams' discomfort and confusion. He asks her, "Were you glad to be ransomed? To come home? To return to God's grace?" It's a leading question. He expects her to say yes, to express relief and gratitude, to thank God for her deliverance from captivity and sin. And Elizabeth, who had spent 7 years dreaming of rescue, who had prayed every day to see England again, who had written letters begging for ransom. She pauses. There's a long pause in the interview. Father Williams notes it. Here she fell silent for some time. Then she says something that clearly confuses and disturbs the priest, something that doesn't fit the narrative he wants to tell. She says, "I was glad, but I was also sorrowful, because I left my sons behind. I left my babies." You see, here's what happened. When the ransom was paid, when the Mercedarian monks negotiated her release, they could only afford to buy Elizabeth's freedom, not her children. Her children were considered free Muslims, the legitimate offspring of their father. They weren't slaves. They couldn't be ransomed. They were Ottoman subjects, born free with rights and status. So Elizabeth had to choose: stay in Tunis as a slave and remain with her children, or accept freedom and leave them behind forever. She chose freedom. Of course she did. What else could she do? Stay enslaved forever? She chose freedom, chose England, chose her old identity, her old life, her old faith. But it broke her. You can see it in the interview. The priest writes that Elizabeth wept through most of the interview. She said her sons were 5 and 3 years old when she left. She said they cried and didn't understand why her mother was leaving. She said her master, their father, promised they would be well cared for, but she didn't believe him. She didn't trust him. She said she died a little when she walked out of that house, left her children crying for her, boarded the ship back to Europe. The interview ends with Elizabeth saying something that I think about all the time, that haunts me. She says, "I am home, Father, but I am not whole. Part of me is still in Tunis. Part of me will always be there. I am 2 women now, one here, one there, and both of them are incomplete." She never married after she returned to England. Thomas, her fiancé, had married someone else years earlier. She lived with her brother's family, helped raise her nieces and nephews. She went to church every Sunday. She confessed regularly, according to church records. And every single day, according to her brother's journal, she prayed for her sons in Tunis. Sons who almost certainly grew up never knowing their mother had been English, never knowing she had been a slave, never knowing she had loved them enough to grieve for them every day for the rest of her life. Elizabeth died in 1671. She was 49 years old, and her last words, according to her brother William, who was at her bedside when she died, were in Arabic, not English, Arabic. She said Abbas, Yusuf, those were her sons' names, Ana Asifa, I'm sorry. William wrote in his journal that he didn't understand the words, but he knew from the way she said them that they were names, that she was calling out to someone far away, that she was saying goodbye to people he had never met, would never meet, whose existence he barely believed in. That's the tragedy. That's the complexity. That's the impossible situation these women found themselves in. Their trauma created new identities, new loyalties, new loves, and then rescue, if it came at all, meant tearing themselves in half, choosing which version of themselves would survive. Now, I need to take a moment here and talk about the long-term impact of these raids, because this wasn't just about individual tragedies. This wasn't just about the women who were taken. This was about the systematic terrorizing of entire coastlines. This was about the psychological and economic damage done to vast regions of Europe. By the early 16th century, large sections of the Mediterranean coast, southern Spain, southern Italy, Sicily, Sardinia, Corsica, the Greek islands, the Adriatic coast, were essentially depopulated. Villages were abandoned, settlements moved inland, people stopped fishing, stopped trading, stopped living near the sea because the risk was too great. The coastal economy collapsed in many regions. In Spain, which bore the brunt of many raids because of its proximity to North Africa, there were watchtowers built every few miles along the coast. These were called Torres de Vigía, watchtowers. You can still see them today dotting the Spanish coastline, stone towers on promontories overlooking the sea. Their purpose was simple: to spot corsair ships before they could land, to light signal fires, to give people time to flee inland before the raiders arrived. Imagine living like that. Imagine organizing your entire life around the possibility of slave raids. Imagine living in constant fear that you might wake up one night to find pirates in your bedroom, ready to drag you and your family onto a ship and sail away with you to a place you'd never heard of, to sell you to people whose language you didn't speak. That was reality for millions of Europeans for 300 years. 3 centuries of terror, 3 centuries of villages maintaining watch schedules, of families sleeping with weapons beside their beds, of children being taught to recognize the distinctive sails of corsair ships so they could run and hide. In some areas, the fear was so great that young women were never allowed near the coast, never. There are records from Italian villages where girls between 12 and 25 years old were kept inland during the summer months, the peak raiding season when the seas were calm and corsairs could operate freely. These girls would be sent to live with relatives or in monasteries inland, away from the coast, only allowed back to their homes in winter when the seas were too rough for corsair ships to operate. Think about what that does to a society. Think about the psychological trauma, the constant vigilance, the way it warped normal life. Fishing communities couldn't fish safely. Trading ships had to travel in armed convoys. Coastal churches were fortified like castles. Normal economic activity ground to a halt in many regions. And here's the thing. European governments knew this was happening. They tried to stop it. They really did. They sent warships to patrol the Mediterranean. They built fortifications, massive star forts, coastal batteries, garrison towns. They negotiated treaties with North African rulers, paying them to stop raiding, or at least to raid someone else's coast instead. But that only protected merchant vessels flying those nations' flags. It didn't protect fishing boats. It didn't protect coastal villages. It didn't stop the raids on unprotected settlements. It just redirected the corsairs towards easier targets, smaller nations that couldn't afford protection money, or remote villages that no one was protecting. The only thing that eventually ended the Barbary slave trade was overwhelming military force. In 1816, after the Napoleonic Wars freed up European military resources, England and the Netherlands sent a combined fleet to Algiers, dozens of warships, hundreds of guns, and essentially bombarded the city into submission. They destroyed the corsair fleet.
Now, I want to talk about something that historians have only recently started to examine in real depth: the children born from these forced unions. The children of European slave women and their Muslim masters. Because these children are key to understanding why the erasure was so complete. These children occupied a strange space in society. In Islamic law, they were considered free. The child of a slave woman and her master was legally free from birth if the master acknowledged paternity, which he usually did for sons at least. These weren't slaves. They were legitimate children with inheritance rights. But socially, culturally, they were marked by their mother's origins. People knew. People always know. In Ottoman society, there was actually a term for these children, and for slaves in general in the Sultan's service: kul. It referred to slaves or former slaves in government service, but it also applied more broadly to people of slave origin. And here's what's interesting, what most people don't know: being a kul wasn't necessarily a disadvantage. It wasn't a mark of shame that kept you from advancement. Actually, the opposite. Many of the most powerful officials in the Ottoman Empire were kuls, or descended from kuls. Some of the most powerful men in the empire came from slave mothers. Why? Because they owed everything to the Sultan. They had no independent power base, no tribal loyalties, no aristocratic families backing them. They weren't part of the old Turkish aristocracy with its ancient feuds and competing loyalties. They were completely dependent on the Sultan's favor, which made them loyal and easy to control. The Sultan could elevate them or destroy them at will. Some of the most powerful Grand Viziers, the equivalent of prime ministers in Ottoman history, were the sons of Christian slave women. They rose to incredible heights of power, commanding armies of tens of thousands, governing provinces, making decisions that affected millions of people, wielding power that European kings would have envied. Sokolu Mehmed Pasha, Grand Vizier from 1565 to 1579, effectively ruled the Ottoman Empire during the reigns of 3 sultans.
He was the son of a Serbian slave woman. Kopruli Mehmed Pasha, Grand Vizier from 1656 to 1661, who saved the empire from collapse during a crisis period, his mother was an Albanian slave. These weren't obscure officials. These were men who shaped history. But here's the thing, they did so by completely erasing any connection to their mother's origins. Their power depended on being seen as completely, authentically Ottoman, completely loyal to the Sultan and to Islam. Any hint of foreign sympathy, any suggestion they might have divided loyalties, any indication they might favor Christians or preserve Christian sympathies could be fatal. So they didn't talk about their mothers. They didn't acknowledge their European or Christian heritage. They became more Ottoman than the Ottomans themselves, more devoted to Islam, more ruthless in service to the Sultan. They proved their loyalty through their actions, often by being harder on Christians than Turkish-born officials were. Think about what that means for these women. Think about being a woman like Cecilia Venier Baffo, the Venetian girl who became Nurbanu Sultan, watching your son Murad III become Sultan, wielding incredible power over a vast empire, but knowing he can never acknowledge where you came from, knowing he has to pretend your past doesn't exist, knowing that your story, your origins, your family in Venice have to be buried and never spoken of. Is that victory? Is that a kind of success? Your son becomes Sultan, but only by erasing you? Or is it just another form of erasure? Another way in which these women were unmade, turned into ghosts, their identities sacrificed for their children's advancement? Let me tell you about one of the darkest aspects of this whole system, something that doesn't get talked about much because the records are fragmentary and the details are horrific. The women who never made it to their final destinations. The ones who died in transit. Because the voyage from Europe to North Africa or the Eastern Mediterranean wasn't easy. These weren't luxury cruises. These weren't even normal passenger ships. These were corsair vessels, built for speed and raiding, designed to outrun European warships, not to transport human cargo safely and comfortably. Captives were kept below deck in cramped, dark holes, chained together, given minimal food and water, just enough to keep them alive, nothing more. No sanitation facilities, one bucket for dozens of people. No privacy, no space to move, no fresh air except what filtered down through gaps in the deckboards. Disease spread rapidly, dysentery, typhus, scurvy, ship fever. In the darkness and filth, infections flourished. People got sick, very sick, and there was no medical care. If you got sick, you either recovered on your own or you died. Contemporary accounts from European sailors who encountered corsair ships or from ransomed captives describing their voyages describe the smell. They say you could tell a slave ship from miles away because of the stench of human waste and death, the smell of dozens or hundreds of unwashed, sick, dying people crammed into an airless hold. And the corsairs didn't really care if some of their captives died en route. They factored it in. They had enough. There was always surplus. They would capture 150 people knowing that maybe 20 or 30 would die during the voyage. A 10 or 15% mortality during the voyage was considered acceptable loss, normal business expenses. But think about what that means in human terms. Think about being chained in the dark, sick and terrified, listening to the person next to you cough and wheeze and eventually fall silent. Think about the bodies being dragged topside and thrown overboard like garbage. Think about being chained to a corpse for hours or days until the corsairs bothered to come below and remove it. There's a particularly harrowing account from 1636, written by a French priest named Father Pierre Dan. He was actually in Algiers as part of a ransom mission, working with the Mercerian order to negotiate for the release of French captives, and he describes meeting a woman who had survived the voyage from Italy just weeks earlier. She told him that during the crossing, one of the young women in the hold had given birth. She had been pregnant when captured, maybe 2 or 3 months along, not showing yet, and the stress and conditions triggered premature labor. The baby was stillborn. The mother hemorrhaged and died within hours, bleeding to death in the dark of the hold. The corsairs didn't even bother bringing the bodies topside for burial at sea. They just left them in the hold with the living captives until the ship reached port 3 days later. 3 days, chained near decomposing bodies in the Mediterranean heat. Father Dan says the woman who told him this story was 18 years old.
She had been traveling from Rome to Naples with her family when their ship was attacked by corsairs. Her parents were killed in the fighting. Her younger brother was wounded and died during the voyage. She was the only survivor from her family. He asked her what her name was. She told him her Christian name, but then she said something that stuck with Father Dan enough that he wrote it down. She said, "It doesn't matter anymore. That girl is dead. That life is over. I am someone else now." She had been in captivity for less than a month. Already she understood. Already she knew. Her old identity was gone. She had to become someone else to survive.
You know, one of the questions I kept asking myself as I researched this story, as I spent months reading letters and documents and testimonies, was why don't we know about this? Why isn't this taught in schools the way the Atlantic slave trade is taught? Why isn't it part of our common historical knowledge? Why isn't there a museum? Why aren't there monuments? Why aren't there films and books and public awareness? And I think there are several reasons, several factors that have combined to erase this history. First, it's uncomfortable. For modern Western Europeans and Americans, it disrupts our narrative about slavery. We're used to thinking of slavery as something Europeans did to others, to Africans primarily, but also to indigenous peoples in the Americas. We have a narrative where Europeans are perpetrators and non-Europeans are victims. That's the story we've internalized, the story that shapes how we think about colonialism and imperialism and racial justice. The idea that Europeans were also victims of slavery on a massive scale doesn't fit neatly into that understanding of history. It complicates things. It forces us to acknowledge that slavery was universal, that every culture practiced it in some form, that the moral equations are more complex than we might like. Second, there's no clear group of descendants to carry the story forward, and this is crucial. As I said earlier, the women were assimilated. Their descendants are scattered across North Africa and the Middle East, completely unaware of their European ancestry. There's no community of survivors, no cultural memory, no movement to commemorate what happened. There's no equivalent of the African American community keeping the memory alive. When African Americans talk about slavery, they're talking about their ancestors, their history, their trauma passed down through generations. It's personal, it's immediate, it's their story. But who tells the story of the European women taken to North Africa? Their descendants don't know about them. Their families in Europe eventually stopped remembering after generations passed. There's no one to carry the torch, no one with a personal stake in keeping the memory alive. Third, and I think this is really important, there's a real legitimate fear of how this history could be misused. In an era of rising nationalism and anti-immigration sentiment in Europe, in an era of Islamophobia and anti-Arab racism, the story of the Barbary slave trade can be weaponized. It can be used, it has been used, to demonize North Africans, to justify contemporary prejudices, to create a narrative of perpetual victimhood that ignores the far larger and more deadly systems of slavery that Europeans themselves operated. Far-right groups in Europe have seized on this history, used it to argue that Muslims have always been the enemy, that immigration from North Africa is a continuation of historical aggression, that European Christians are the real victims. They use this history cynically, selectively, dishonestly. And that's a legitimate concern. I'm not going to pretend it's not. The last thing I want to do is provide ammunition for bigots and racists. The last thing I want is for this video to be shared by people using it to justify hatred. But here's the thing. We can't let the fear of misuse prevent us from telling true stories. We can't let political considerations cause us to erase real human suffering from the historical record. We can't let bad people weaponizing history stop us from remembering history. What happened to Anne Barrett, to Gudrun Simonadottir, to Cecilia Venier Baffo, to Elizabeth Morgan, to Isabel Nicastro, to the women of Baltimore and Hamae and 1,000 other forgotten villages, it was real, it was horrible, it happened, and it deserves to be remembered. Not to fuel hatred, not to create division, not to justify contemporary prejudices, but to honor the women who suffered, to acknowledge their pain,
to say their names, the ones we still know, and to grieve for the thousands whose names are lost forever, to bear witness to the full complexity of human history, including the parts that are uncomfortable. Because here's the truth. Acknowledging the Barbary slave trade doesn't diminish the horror of the Atlantic slave trade. Both were evil. Both caused immense suffering. Both need to be remembered. History isn't a competition of suffering. We can remember all victims of all forms of slavery without diminishing any of them.
But before we end, let me tell you about another dimension of this tragedy that we haven't fully explored. What happened to the families left behind? Because for every woman taken, there were parents, siblings, children, husbands left behind, living with not knowing, living with absence, living with a grief that had no resolution, no closure, no end. There's a church in Cornwall called St. Senara's in the village of Zenner. If you visit today, you can see something remarkable and heartbreaking. A collection of memorial stones dating from the 17th century. But these aren't ordinary memorials. These are memorials for people who have no graves, for people who disappeared. One stone, dated 1638, reads, "In memory of Margaret Pierce, beloved daughter, taken by Moors to unknown lands, 1635. May God keep her soul." Another, from 1642, Catherine Hosking, aged 19, stolen by Turks, her fate unknown. God protect her. And another, Mary Kemp and her daughter Jane, lost to slavers, 1644. May angels watch over them wherever they are. Think about what it means to erect a memorial for someone who isn't dead, who might still be alive somewhere, suffering in captivity. Think about the kind of grief that requires. Grief without resolution, grief without a body to bury, grief that can never properly end because there's always the faint hope that maybe, somehow, they might come back. There are dozens of these stones in coastal churches across Europe. In Ireland, especially in Cork and Kerry, which bore the brunt of many raids. In Scotland, in the Western Isles and along the Firth of Forth. In Spain and Portugal, where entire cemeteries have sections dedicated to the disappeared. In Italy, particularly in Sicily and Sardinia, memorials to the taken, to the women and children and men who were there one day and gone the next, swallowed by the sea and by history. And the families lived with not knowing, and I think that might be worse in some ways than knowing someone is dead. At least death provides closure. At least you can mourn, hold a funeral, bury them, say goodbye. At least you can eventually, painfully, move on with your life. But not knowing? That's a special kind of torture. That's a wound that can never heal because it never closes. Is she alive? Is she suffering? Is she being beaten, starved, abused? Or is she being treated well? Has she converted? Has she married? Does she have children? Is she thinking of us? Does she remember us? Has she forgotten us? Should we still hope? Should we let go? How do you mourn someone who might not be dead? Some families waited for decades, literally decades. There are records from Spanish archives of parents waiting 40, 50 years for news, for word, for anything. Always hoping that maybe their daughter would return, always listening for rumors from travelers, always asking merchants who had been to North Africa, "Did you see her? Did you hear anything? A young woman from our village, blonde hair, taken 20 years ago? Does the description sound familiar?" Most died still waiting, still hoping, never knowing. Their last words often being prayers for the daughter or wife or sister who had vanished decades earlier. There's a particularly heartbreaking letter from a father in Ireland, dated 1645, written to a priest. His father, Patrick, writes, and I'm translating from the original Irish, "Father, I have tried to accept that she is gone. I have tried to let her go as my wife begs me to do, but I cannot. Every morning I wake, and for a moment I forget, and then I remember, and the grief is fresh as the day she was taken.
I see her in every young woman who passes by our door. I hear her voice in the wind. I catch the scent of her hair and flowers. At night I dream she is calling for me, calling, "Father, Father, help me," and I cannot reach her. I run, but I cannot move. My wife says I must let her go, that I am torturing myself, that God has taken her for His purposes. But Father, how can I? She is my daughter. She will always be my daughter, wherever she is, whatever has become of her. Until I know for certain that she is dead, how can I stop hoping? That father, Patrick O'Sullivan, died in 1652, 7 years after writing that letter. He died never knowing what happened to his daughter Mary. She was actually alive at the time of his death. I found a record of her in the archives in Tunis. She was living there under the name Amina, married to a fabric merchant named Ibrahim al-Qattan. She had 3 children. By all accounts, she was treated reasonably well, not beaten, given a certain amount of freedom within the household, her children recognized as legitimate. But she had no way to send word to Ireland, no way to tell her father she had survived, no way to ease his pain, or her mother's pain, or her siblings' pain. The distance was too great. The systems for communication didn't exist. Even if she had tried to send a letter, the chances of it reaching a small Irish village were essentially zero. So Patrick died thinking his daughter was suffering horribly or dead, and Mary, Amina, lived the rest of her life knowing her father had probably died thinking she was lost, never knowing she had survived, never knowing about his grandchildren, never knowing that she thought of him until the day she died, decades later in Tunis. This is another layer of the tragedy, the ripples of suffering spreading outward from each capture, affecting dozens of people, entire communities. For every woman taken, there were maybe 10 or 20 people whose lives were shattered. Parents who never recovered, siblings who grew up in the shadow of a sister's absence, children who grew up without mothers, husbands who never remarried, because how could they when they didn't know if their wives were alive or dead? Villages were traumatized, communities fractured, the social fabric was torn apart. In Baltimore, after the raid of 1631, the village essentially ceased to function. Most of the survivors left. The economy collapsed because so many workers were gone. The church had no congregation. Houses stood empty. It took generations for the village to recover, and it was never quite the same. Similar stories played out across coastal Europe. Towns that lost large portions of their populations in raids never fully recovered. The trauma echoed through generations. Great-grandchildren grew up hearing stories about the time the Moors came, about relatives who vanished, about the terror that had defined their ancestors' lives. And here's something fascinating and sad. Modern genetic studies confirm what the historical record suggests. Genetic analysis of populations in North Africa shows significant European maternal lineage markers, meaning they're descended through the female line from European women. That's millions of people carrying the genetic legacy of the Barbary slave trade. But if you asked any of them if they have European ancestry, they would say no. They have no reason to think they do. Their families have been Muslim for centuries, their languages are Arabic or Berber, their cultures are North African. The women who brought that European DNA into their bloodlines have been forgotten so completely that their genetic legacy is a mystery even to their own descendants. That's the ultimate form of erasure, when even your DNA can't tell your story because the story has been so thoroughly erased that no one knows to look for it. And maybe, and this is what gives me some small measure of hope, maybe by telling these stories, by remembering these women, by refusing to let them disappear a second time from history, we can begin to repair that erasure. Not completely. We can never completely undo what was done. We can never give these women back their names or their lives or their identities. We can never reunite them with the families they mourned them. We can never heal the trauma they endured. But we can remember them. We can say, you existed, you mattered, your suffering was real, your story deserves to be told.
You were not just numbers in a ledger or inventory in a slave market. You were human beings with names and families and dreams and futures that were stolen from you. And now, at least for a moment, we've broken that silence. We've said their names, we've told their stories, we remembered. And maybe that's all we can do. Maybe bearing witness is enough. Maybe remembering is enough. Maybe refusing to let them be forgotten is enough. So thank you for listening. Thank you for bearing witness with me. Thank you for spending this time remembering women you never knew existed, women whose names you never heard, women who suffered in ways we can barely imagine. These women, they deserve that much. They deserve to be remembered. They deserve to have their stories told. They deserve to be more than a footnote in history, more than a few lines in a dusty book, more than silence and absence. They deserve to be remembered. And now, at least, they are.